there is a secret hiding inside one of the most analyzed comedies ever put on film. Not a prop in the background, not a blink, and you miss it cameo, not some trivia answer floating around on the internet. This secret lived in the body language of one man, in the pauses between his words, in the way he held his hands when the cameras were rolling. Gene Wilder carried something into Blazing Saddles that nobody in the audience fully understood, and for decades, even the most devoted fans walked away from the theater laughing without ever realizing what had actually happened to them. Wilder himself, in his later years, finally began to pull back the curtain on what he was really doing during that production. And when you understand it, truly understand it, the entire film shifts. What you thought was a comedy gets a little heavier. What you thought was a joke becomes something closer to a confession. So let's talk about what Gene Wilder finally revealed, and why most fans never figured it out until now. To understand what Wilder brought to Blazing Saddles, you first have to understand how he got there. Because the story begins not with a casting call or a studio meeting, but with a crisis. The production had originally cast Gig Young in the role of the Waco Kid. Young was a respected Hollywood figure, an Oscar winner with real dramatic weight behind his name. On paper, the choice made sense. He could bring a certain world weariness to the aging gunslinger that Mel Brooks was after. But on the very first day of filming, everything unraveled. Young arrived on set visibly unwell. He was trembling, sweating, and unable to hold his lines together. Initially, some people on set weren't sure what to make of it. By mid-morning, he had collapsed entirely. The truth was that Gig Young was in the grip of severe alcohol withdrawal, a medical emergency that halted production and left the entire film in a precarious position. The studio had a hole where its second lead was supposed to be, and there was no easy solution waiting in the wings. Mel Brooks did not hold auditions. He did not call his agent or flip through a roster. He picked up the phone and called Gene Wilder directly, a man he had worked with on The Producers and trusted in ways that went well beyond professional respect. What happened next says everything about the kind of performer Wilder was. He did not ask to read the script. He did not negotiate his salary or demand time to prepare. He simply said yes, booked a flight, and arrived on set within 24 hours. That single decision, made quickly and without hesitation, would quietly alter the course of American comedy. Most serious actors spend weeks, sometimes months, preparing for a significant role. They study the script, work with dialect coaches, develop backstory, and build the character layer by layer before a camera ever rolls. Gene Wilder had none of that. He stepped off a plane still carrying jet lag, walked onto a chaotic film set, and was expected to fill the shoes of a character nobody had yet properly defined. What happened next was not what anyone anticipated. Rather than scrambling to catch up, Wilder did something counterintuitive. He slowed down. In an environment of creative frenzy, with Mel Brooks operating at full velocity and a cast of fearless performers swinging for the fences with every take, Wilder quietly found the stillest corner of the character and planted himself there. He made a decision, reportedly before he had even finished reading through the pages, that he was not going to play the Waco Kid as a comedic figure in the traditional sense. He was going to play him as a man. This choice sounds simple when you describe it. In practice, it was a radical act. Blazing Saddles was being made as a loud, satirical, boundary-destroying comedy. Every instinct in the production design, the performances, and the writing was pushing toward exaggeration. And here was Gene Wilder, one of the two leads, deciding to go in the opposite direction entirely. He later reflected that he saw something in the Waco Kid that felt deeply familiar to him, a person who had once been extraordinary, who had burned too bright, and who now lived with the particular exhaustion of someone who no longer believed the world deserved their best. That is not a comedy note. That is a human condition. The screenplay for Blazing Saddles was a remarkable document. CO written by Richard Pryor, Mel Brooks, Andrew Bergman, Norman Steinberg, and Alan Yuger. It was sharp, fearless, and structurally innovative in ways that film scholars still discuss. But like any script, it had a surface and a depth, and not every actor who touched it would necessarily go looking for what was underneath. Wilder went looking. He has spoken in interviews about reading The Waco Kid not as a comedic foil or a drunk sidekick, but as a man carrying genuine grief. The trembling hands were not just a visual gag. To Wilder, they represented the physical cost of witnessing too much, doing too much, and ultimately being failed by the thing you devoted your life to. The Waco Kid had been the fastest gun in the West. He had been the best at something that the world had told him mattered. And then one day, a 6-year-old had beaten him to the draw, and the myth of himself had shattered. Wilder played that shattering. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way real people carry broken things, quietly, while still showing up for breakfast. When he delivers the famous story about his past in the jailhouse scene, the line readings are not structured to get a laugh first and an emotion second. They are structured to tell a true story that happens to be absurd. The humor comes from the gap between the tragedy and the delivery. Wilder understood that the funniest things are often the saddest things described without self-pity, and he built The Waco Kid entirely on that principle. Here's the part that even dedicated fans of the film tend to overlook, even after multiple viewings. The Waco Kid is never really trying to be funny. Every laugh he generates comes not from performance but from observation. He is a man standing slightly outside the chaos, watching it with tired eyes and the occasional dry remark, the way someone who has already lived through the worst tends to watch things that would horrify others. Wilder constructed this through physical choices that barely register consciously. The way he holds his body in scenes, often loose and slightly deflated, as if the energy required to be fully upright is energy he's choosing to spend elsewhere. The way his eyes move in group scenes, frequently observing rather than reacting. The way he delivers lines with a fraction of a second of delay, not enough to be noticeable but enough to feel like a man who considered his words before releasing them. These are not accidental details. These are the marks of an actor who had built an entire inner life for a character and was living inside it rather than performing it from the outside. Mel Brooks later acknowledged this openly. He said that Wilder brought something to the role that was not in any draft of the script, an emotional authenticity that made the entire world of the film feel more real by contrast. When the absurdity around the Waco Kid reaches its peak, it is more absurd because he is grounded. When the satire lands its sharpest blows, they cut deeper because there is a human being in the room who seems to actually feel the weight of them. That is the quiet genius fans kept missing, because the film was so loud and so funny that the thing holding it together was easy to look past. Any serious conversation about Blazing Saddles has to reckon with Richard Pryor, because his presence in the film is enormous, even though he never appears on screen. Pryor was instrumental in writing the screenplay, and his fingerprints are all over the film's willingness to confront American racism with a directness that made studio executives deeply uncomfortable. He was also originally the man Mel Brooks wanted for the role of Sheriff Bart. Warner Brothers blocked the casting. Their concerns centered on Pryor's public reputation and his personal struggles at the time, and their decision stood. Cleavon Little was cast instead, and delivered a performance of real charisma and wit. But the ghost of that other version of the film lingers, particularly when you consider what Wilder later said about it. Wilder and Pryor would eventually work together on Silver Streak and Stir Crazy, creating one of the most celebrated comedic partnerships in Hollywood history. Wilder was candid in later years about the chemistry they shared, describing it as something that felt almost effortless. Two completely different energies that somehow amplified each other rather than competing. He reflected that had Pryor played Bart in Blazing Saddles, the dynamic between their characters would have been electric in ways that the film, as beloved as it is, never quite achieved. What this tells us about Wilder is something important. He was not simply an actor showing up to do a job. He was someone who thought about the architecture of comedic relationships, who understood that the best comedy partnerships are built on contrast, and who genuinely mourned the version of things that never got to happen. That level of investment, that attentiveness to what a film could have been alongside what it was, is part of what made his actual contributions so substantial. The story of Gene Wilder on the set of Blazing Saddles is not only about what he did in front of the lens. The people who worked alongside him during production have consistently described an atmosphere around him that was stabilizing in ways that a chaotic film shoot desperately needed. Brooks led with volcanic creative energy, and that energy was essential to the film being made at all. But energy without grounding can tip into disorder, and Wilder functioned as a kind of quiet counterweight. Between takes, he was attentive to the people around him. He offered guidance to less experienced performers in a way a seasoned stage actor might, not through correction or instruction, but through example and the occasional well-placed observation. He listened carefully, which is rarer on a film set than it sounds, and he had the ability, which very few performers possess, to remain fully present in a high-pressure environment without adding to the pressure. It was during this downtime, these pockets of relative quiet between the organized chaos of production, that something else significant happened. Wilder began talking to Brooks about an idea that had been developing in his mind. A story about a man who bore one of the most famous names in the history of horror, and who wanted nothing more than to be left alone by the legacy attached to it. The seed of young Frankenstein was planted on the set of Blazing Saddles, in conversations born from creative trust between two people who had figured out how to make each other better. That alone tells you something about the kind of environment Wilder helped create simply by being who he was. Blazing Saddles did not arrive in theaters without a fight. The studio was persistently uncomfortable with the film's racial satire, its language, its willingness to name the ugliness it was, skewering rather than softening it into something more palatable. Memos were written. Conversations were had. There was real pressure to dilute the film, to sand down its edges, to make it safer for audiences who might be made uncomfortable by a comedy that asked them to recognize themselves in the villains. Mel Brooks resisted, and Gene Wilder stood behind him. Not loudly, not with dramatic speeches or public declarations, but with the consistent, quiet weight of someone who understood what was at stake. Wilder believed that satire without discomfort was decoration. He had seen what happened when comedy flinched from its own implications, and he had no interest in participating in that kind of retreat. He reportedly made his position clear in private conversations during the production, urging Brooks to trust the material, to trust the audience, and to resist the institutional pressure to be less than what the film was capable of being. This is the dimension of Wilder's contribution that tends to get the least attention because it happened behind closed doors and did not produce visible footage. But it mattered. When a filmmaker is under pressure to compromise their vision, the voices around them either push toward courage or toward accommodation, and Wilder pushed toward courage. The film that exists, uncompromised and still challenging, is partly a reflection of that. In the years following Blazing Saddles, Gene Wilder gave a number of interviews in which he reflected on the production with the kind of candor that public figures often reserve for later in life, when there is less to lose and more worth saying clearly. What emerged from those conversations was a portrait of a performer who had approached the entire experience with unusual intentionality. He talked about the decision to play the Waco Kid as a man in genuine pain, and about how that decision was not entirely separate from his own interior life. Wilder was a person of deep sensitivity, someone who had experienced loss and difficulty, and who brought that experience to his work rather than setting it aside at the studio gate. The Waco Kid's exhaustion was not a character note he invented from nothing. It was something he recognized. He also talked about what it meant to work in a film that was trying to do something serious inside an absurd container. He described Blazing Saddles not primarily as a comedy, but as a piece of social observation that used comedy as its method, and he spoke about the responsibility that came with that. The responsibility to make the human parts feel real enough that the satirical parts could actually land. If the characters are only jokes, the satire is only noise. Wilder understood that he was the element that kept the noise from being all there was. Decades after its release, Blazing Saddles remains one of the most discussed films in American comedy, and the conversations around it keep changing as culture changes. What Wilder's performance contributes to those conversations is something that does not diminish with time. If anything, it grows more visible as the film ages, because the qualities that made his work so effective, restraint, emotional honesty, intelligence, and a refusal to perform for approval, are the same qualities that tend to age best. He proves something with the Waco Kick that every generation of filmmakers and performers gets to rediscover: that the loudest thing in any room is rarely the most powerful. That comedy, at its best, is not about making people laugh, but about making people feel something true, and that laughter is often just the sound of recognition. He showed that you can be funny without mugging, emotional without sentimentality, and subversive without announcing yourself. The Library of Congress deemed Blazing Saddles worthy of preservation in the National Film Registry, recognizing it as culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. Gene Wilder's contribution